investigating the president.
And he just said, I want nothing. I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. Tell Zelensky to do the right thing.
Testimony continues in the impeachment inquiry. We have team coverage and reaction. A warm welcome. Pope Francis arrives in Thailand for a 3-day visit, why it also was a family reunion. Buffalo Bishop meeting, the latest on the embattled church leader from New York after his talk with the Holy Father. And fighting for the faithful. A religious freedom advocate pleads for the U.S. to help persecuted Christians in Lebanon. On EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, November 20th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. The most highly anticipated witness in the ongoing impeachment probe into President Donald Trump testifies publicly. Ambassador Gordon Sondland says he pushed for a political quid pro quo with Ukraine because it's what the president wanted.
We followed the president's orders.
House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff says Ambassador Sondland's testimony goes right to the heart of the issue of bribery.
Although President Trump claimed to you there was no quid pro quo, he also made it clear to you in that call that President Zelensky had to, quote, clear things up and do it in public.
At the center of the impeachment inquiry, Democrats allege President Trump demanded investigations into former Vice President Joe Biden and his son. Biden's son Hunter was a board member of the Ukrainian gas company Burisma.
We have our country.
In return, Ukraine would receive military aid dollars.
But it was always Burisma to me, and I didn't know about the connection between Burisma and Biden.
Chairman Adam Schiff expressed surprise at Sondland's testimony the president was seeking an investigation into his now Democratic rival, Joe Biden.
You never put Burisma together with the Bidens?
I didn't.
And Republicans criticized Sondland for his lack of memory of key events, disputing his credibility.
You don't have records, you don't have your notes because you didn't take notes, you don't have a lot of recollections. I mean, this is the trifecta of unreliability, isn't that true?
As these recollections have been refreshed by subsequent testimony, by some texts and emails that I've now had access to, I think I filled in a lot of blanks.
But a lot of it's speculation. A lot of it is your guess, and we're talking about, an impeachment of the President of the United States. So the evidence here ought to be pretty darn good.
Sondland pointed out he has cooperated with the House inquiry against the wishes of the White House. House Republicans called the process unfair. They say Americans see through the Democrats' unfounded attempt to impeach the president. Joining me now from Capitol Hill is Representative Alex Mooney, Republican from West Virginia. Congressman, welcome into the broadcast. How significant was Ambassador Sondland's testimony in your view? Was it a blow at all to the president?
Well, I don't think it was significant at all. These are second-hand and sometimes third-hand discussions that are happening. The president already released a transcript, shows there was nothing to the attacks the Democrats are making. First they've been wanting to impeach President Trump from the moment he got elected. For 3 years now, they've been digging and digging and digging. First, they tried collusion with Russia and the Mueller report. That came up completely empty. So they're just moving on to the next person, the next person, the next person. So I don't think it was significant at all. I think this is terrible for the country. We got to move on to real issues.
You've tweeted that this process has been unfair to President Trump, but now that the hearings are public, does that help to make things at least a little bit more fair?
I'm glad they're public so the American people can see the charade going on down here. But what also needs to be understood is that only Democrats can call witnesses. The president and the Republicans are not allowed to call their own witnesses. So it's still a one-sided hearing. So I'm glad it's public. I'm glad that I and other members of Congress went into this secret skiff a few weeks ago to force the issue of these secret hearings being completely wrong. I'm glad we did that, but it's still a one-sided hearing where we can't call our own witnesses. Completely unfair.
Well, speaking of that, we've not heard some testimony from several administration officials, including Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. Would you like to hear from him during these proceedings or others in the White House?
I'd be welcome to hear from anybody that wants to talk about it and help show the president the side of the story. But again, we should have the right to call the witnesses the president really should have the right to call his own witnesses. This is basic fairness in the American legal system, that you have a right to defend yourself, you have a right to face your accusers, and you have a right to call witnesses to tell your side of the story. What you're having here is Democrats calling witnesses who are saying what they want to say, and the Republicans not being able to call witnesses to tell a different side of the story. So it's kind of pre-rigged. So I think it's not just Mick Mulvaney, it's anybody who the president would like to speak on his behalf should be allowed to be subpoenaed and forced to testify, including the whistleblower who started this whole thing.
What are you hearing from your constituents?
My constituents think that this is a total waste of time. There are issues that are important to West Virginia and America, getting our roads fixed, dealing with the opioid crisis, health care, supporting veterans. There are things we should be working on, the military. All that stuff is stopped for the entire month. All we've been talking about is impeachment around here. We're not getting any real work done that should be done. The Democrats have really gotten, in my view, hijacked by the far left. This is the most pro-life president we've ever had. He stands for the unborn, religious freedom, and those on the radical left just can't take that. We have an election next year. That should be the focus of those who hate President Trump, not these distractive hearings that have nothing to it.
All right, we will continue to follow the hearings, how they play out, however they end up playing out. And we appreciate your coming on to at least give your thoughts about it. Congressman Alex Mooney, Republican from West Virginia, we appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
The president responded positively to today's testimony, saying he believes he's been vindicated and that congressional inquiry should end. He also insists he wanted nothing from Ukraine as part of a quid pro quo. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. I stood just feet from the president as he read from handwritten notes. He was responding to Ambassador Sondland's testimony, which the president repeated to the press.
I want nothing. I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo.
President Trump repeated what stood out to him in today's testimony from Ambassador Gordon Sondland. Sondland's recollection of a call he had with President Trump. He asked the president what exactly he wanted from Ukraine.
And it was a very short, abrupt conversation. He was not in a good mood. And he just said, I want nothing. I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo.
President Trump believes that statement from Sondland should end the impeachment investigation.
This is the final word from the President of the United States. I want nothing.
But Ambassador Sondland also testified there was a quid pro quo involving Ukraine, investigating the 2016 election and the company that hired Vice President Joe Biden's son Hunter in exchange for a White House meeting. And Sondland implicated Vice President Mike Pence, saying he was aware of a pressure campaign against Ukraine.
I was in a briefing with several people, and I just spoke up and I said, it appears that everything is stalled until this statement gets made. And the vice president nodded like, he heard what I said, and that was pretty much it, as I recall.
The vice president's office shot back today, saying Vice President Pence, quote, never had a conversation with Gordon Sondland about investigating the Bidens, Burisma, or the conditional release of financial aid to Ukraine based upon potential investigations.
Sondland says the request for a quid pro quo involving a potential White House visit for the Ukrainian president came from President Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. Sondland says Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States, and he and other top officials were well aware that these investigations were very important to the president. Wyatt.
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. Pope Francis arrives in Bangkok, Thailand today to begin his 3-day visit. His trip is expected to boost the morale of the small Catholic community in the Southeast Asian nation. The Holy Father will speak about human trafficking and peacemaking.
มีความสำคัญค่ะเพราะว่าท่านเป็นตัวแทนของความรักแล้วก็เป็นตัวแทนของ
This Thai woman says the Holy Father represents good, decent people, and he serves as an example for society. The Catholic community represents less than 1% of its 65 million people. The country's main religion is Buddhism. Pope Francis' visit marks the 350th anniversary of a stable Catholic presence in the country. Alan Holdren is the EWTN Vatican Bureau Chief. He joins us from Rome. Alan, you've been talking to Catholic news agency's Hannah Brockhouse, who's traveling with the Pope. We'll check in with her tomorrow, but what was the reaction when the Pope landed in Thailand?
Well, Wyatt, it's that typical festive atmosphere when the Pope arrives in a foreign country. He comes off the airplane to song and dance and an honor guard. In this case, there were 11 small children dressed in this hill tribe attire from the far reaches of Thailand who were there to greet him. Also, a second cousin of the Pope's who's going to be serving as his interpreter for this trip. She's an Argentinian missionary sister who's been there for more than 50 years. She was there in her white habit to greet him. And, you know, when he was going through the streets, we saw what is typical of papal visits of waving flags, school children on the streets, both Thai and Vatican flags. He arrived to the nunciature earlier today, and he didn't have any real public events. He was going to have lunch there and celebrate a private mass. We have since seen that he also sent a video message to young people by way of a cell phone. So he's busy, even though it's been a private day.
Yeah, certainly a warm welcome and, like you say, a busy day so far. So what can we expect from this 3-day visit to Thailand, and what topics will be brought up?
Well, Wyatt, it's like most papal trips to foreign lands. It's divided into two halves. He's going to be meeting with state officials, the diplomatic corps, in this case the King of Thailand, the Prime Minister. And then he's going to be celebrating a major mass at the end of tomorrow in a stadium with 50,000 people. Imagine this in a nation where there are only 380,000 Catholics. So it's more than 10% of the population that could be there for that. A lot of people will be coming from other parts of Southeast Asia, it sounds like, as well. And then the second day, he'll be dedicated to meeting with the Catholic community, bishops, young people celebrating Mass with them in the cathedral, and also religious and just priests of the Diocese of Thailand. So he's got 2 full days after today. At the end of that third day, he'll be taking off for Japan.
Let's follow up with you on that. So after Thailand, like you say, the Holy Father will head to Japan. Why is that stop so important?
Well, in Japan, he's going to be marking the anniversary of the end of the Second World War, and also the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that took so many lives. There is a small but strong Catholic population in those places, but in particular he wants to go there and, as he's done so many times over the years, make calls for nuclear disarmament, to not repeat those facts of the past.
Very interesting. Well, of course, we'll continue to follow all of the Pope's trip as he continues through Thailand and then Japan. Alan Holdren, EWTN Vatican Bureau Chief, thanks so much for the update.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Schools in Hong Kong have reopened today after being closed for nearly a week, but some anti-government protesters remain held up on a university campus. The demonstrators say they're preparing for a showdown with police. One protester says he would prefer to keep fighting rather than surrender. Many of those who were on the campus of Hong Kong Polytechnic University earlier this week surrendered to security forces. The occupation of the university comes as part of a week full of heated protests. At least 23 people are killed after Israel launches a wide-scale operation against Iranian targets in Syria. Fighter jets hit multiple targets belonging to a unit of Iran's elite Revolutionary Guards. The move was a response to rocket fire launched on the Israeli-controlled Golan Heights yesterday. Coming up, embattled Buffalo Bishop Richard Malone reveals what the Holy Father told him last week. And the United Nations hears from survivors of religious persecution. We have a report from New York. Bishop Richard Malone says he is wholly committed to healing the Diocese of Buffalo. The 73-year-old has faced calls to resign following his handling of clergy sexual abuse allegations. But in a video released yesterday, Bishop Malone said he has no plans to step down. He also said Pope Francis was, quote, very understanding and kind about the situation. The two spoke during a meeting last week in Rome. For more on the story, including the background of the claims against Bishop Malone, visit our partners at CatholicNewsAgency.com. Survivors of religious persecution from around the world gather in New York today to tell their stories. They spoke at the Listening to Survivors of Religious Persecution, the Call for Religious Freedom, an event hosted by the Holy See Mission to the UN and Aid to the Church in Need. Priests and nuns from Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and the Philippines spoke about their firsthand experiences of being attacked for their Christian faith. Participants also heard from witnesses who suffered different forms of violent attacks and discrimination. Our United Nations correspondent, Sabrina Furey, was at the conference. She joins us now from New York with more on the issue. Sabrina, tell us a little bit more about the plight of persecuted Christians around the world. How many Christians are experiencing persecution and where?
The numbers were shocking, Wyatt. Between 250 and 300 million Christians are persecuted around the world. To put that in context, that's 1 in 7 Christians in 143 countries. In fact, the most persecuted religion in the world today is Christianity. The worst areas are Southeast Asia, countries like India, Sri Lanka, the Philippines, Pakistan. In Africa, we see this in countries like Mali, Benin, Burkina Faso, and Nigeria. And of course, in North Korea, we have 70,000 Christians in labor camps who are there simply because they're Christians.
It is pretty scary. So why are Christians being targeted?
The number one reason is Islamist violence, and we see this in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. But another reason are nationalist groups. For example, in India, there are Hindu nationalist groups that have carried out thousands of attacks between the years of 2017 and 2019. Last year, they burned down 100 churches in India. Another reason are state authorities. This is where there is violence on the part of the police or local government authorities against Christians, or the government won't follow up or investigate crimes against Christians.
Pretty horrific if you think your own authorities won't stand up for you. One of the issues which came up today is that the mainstream media does not report on the plight of the persecuted Christians to the same extent that it reports on other religious or ethnic groups. Why is that?
The first reason is that apparently we are numbed by statistics. We as Christians don't voice it enough, even though we are the majority religion in the United States by far. I spoke with Edward Clancy of Aid to the Church in Need, and he said that his Jewish brothers and sisters have told him, "You Christians should speak out. We would. Why don't you?" He said it's incumbent on every single Christian to raise their voice on this issue of persecution. The mainstream media, especially in this country, needs to be reminded and pushed by us.
Such an important issue and one that we think is so vital here on EWTN, and we'll continue to cover it. Sabrina Furey, UN correspondent. Thanks so much, Sabrina.
Thanks, Wyatt.
Up next, an update on Christians who are under threat in Lebanon. The political unrest that has gripped Lebanon since mid-October continues as the country experiences its worst financial crisis in decades. Thousands of protesters rallied against the government yesterday, blocking roads in central Beirut and preventing lawmakers from reaching the parliament for legislative session. The country is still without a cabinet following the prime minister's resignation amid demonstrations over proposed new taxes. Join me now to talk about what this political and financial instability could mean for Christians in Lebanon is Nina Shea, Director for the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute. Nina, welcome back to the broadcast.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us a little bit more details here, Nina. What has been going on in Lebanon and what has prompted the unrest that we're seeing?
There are protests, street protests throughout the country of all the different religions in this very sectarian country. So it's a pluralistic country. They're all out in the street, about 1 million of them. And this is a very small country of about 5 million people. So it's almost a quarter of the population. And it's been going on for a month. And they are protesting the dire economic situation. It's going to get worse, frankly. It's about to collapse. This is a country with a very high debt to GDP ratio, the third highest in the world, in fact. The inflation looms, the hard currency reserves are very low, and the banks have been closing or limiting, restricting withdrawals. And this is extremely dire for a country like Lebanon that depends on imports. They don't have the hard currency to get flour to make bread or to have oil or gas. So this is shutting down the country, and that's really the underlying problem.
And of course, this is all on top of the fact that they're in a part of the world that's so dangerous in the Middle East. Like I said, you described this as a dire threat. You've also done so when you wrote a piece about this. What concerns you the most out of all those problems?
Well, of all those problems, what we're seeing now is chaos. We're seeing political anarchy, and it could be prolonged, as well as economic chaos and collapse. So this will be very bad for particularly the Christian minorities, because in this kind of vacuum of chaos, we've seen them basically eradicated from Iraq, all but eradicated from Iraq and Syria. So Lebanon is the country in the Levant, or in the Middle East, actually, with the largest percentage of Christians per population. If Lebanon goes, the homes of the patriarchs, of about half a dozen patriarchs, will go. The safe haven in times of genocide for people from Turkey in the Armenian genocide to the ISIS genocide have gone there and found a shelter there, found a safe haven. That will be gone as well. It'll shake the Christians throughout the entire region, Wyatt, to the core.
And many people don't realize that many Christians have fled to Lebanon and all of this as a safe haven. In October, when protests first began, Pope Francis said a resolution to this crisis in Lebanon would be, quote, for the benefit of the entire Middle East region, which suffers so much. Since then, as you mentioned, Catholic leaders in Lebanon and the United States have expressed their solidarity with the people there. If there's not an end to the unrest, if there's not a swift end at least, what could this mean for the rest of the region?
Yeah, well, this will be upheaval for the rest of the region as well. We're seeing similar protests taking place in Iraq and now in Iran. And they're somewhat linked, because they are linked because of, in Lebanon, it's Hezbollah, which is a proxy for Iran. It's been called by Secretary Pompeo as a client state of Iran. In Iraq, they're clearly trying to push out the Iranian militias there. And Iran itself, the people are in the streets. All the internet has been shut off there by the government. But we have been receiving some reports that there have been 100 or more killings in Iran, and people are protesting clerical rule there. So they want to be free. And the U.S. needs to be more engaged. And I wrote a piece for Fox News this week saying that precisely that we haven't spoken up enough to give encouragement to these protesters, either in Iraq, which is very important to their morale, or to Lebanon. We should also be not ahead of the protesters, but we should be facilitating a quick resolution with having the current corrupt government, which the protesters are denouncing in Lebanon, to be replaced.
It's such an important issue, and we're so happy to highlight the Christians there who are potentially at risk. Nina Shea, Director for the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute, thanks so much for your analysis.
Thank you.
And that concludes our newscast for tonight. We thank you for watching. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. We'll leave you tonight with more from the Pope in Thailand. Good night, and God bless.